7. The journey through the city started peacefully. Common folk meandered around the bustling streets, going about their evening business. Families and friends dined and laughed. The sounds of commerce were everywhere. Most of the residents were other Eladrin, but Gryph spotted a few humans and several squat bearded men whom he guessed were dwarves. They were the minority to be sure, but all three races seemed amiable, despite the rangers' spitting hatred of the Thalmir traders. As the troop approached, greetings rang from the streets. Children ran up to them, and men and women alike smiled, greeting the returning warriors. It seemed a joyous occasion, and then eyes grew wide, and gasps of shock led to silence and whispering. It took a moment for Gryph to realize that the townsfolk were reacting not to him, but to Ovrim. Children hid behind parents, faces went pale, and eyes sparked with anger.
"Accursed!"
Gryph heard someone say in a tone that suggested they did not believe their own eyes.
"Fallen!"
Another voice said.
"Demon!"
Came a third. Barendiel held up a fist, and the rangers closed ranks on Ovrim.
"There is no reason for alarm, my friends,"
Barendiel said in a strong but calm voice.
"The regent will know what to do."
The sounds did not abate, but the tone of the shocked and surprised voices took on a more confident sound. Whoever this regent was, he seemed to have the faith of his people. The rangers led them through the town without incident, and they passed through a gate in a low wall onto a large green area. Arvendiel dominated the space. Up close, she was even grander than it had seemed from the edge of town. What was she like in her prime? Wick walked up to him and whispered,
"I don't know what this conclave thing is, but I'm pretty sure my life and Ovrim's are in your hands. Don't screw it up."
Gryph scowled and muttered,
"Great. Not filling me with confidence."
"I don't even know what the hell conclave is."
"Conclave is an ancient privilege granted to any member of the four peoples who formed the alliance," Ovrim said. "It grants you the right to present your case before an authorized representative of the alliance. It was one of the few fair tribunals in all the realms."
"Well, that sounds okay," Wick said.
"However, my small friend, you stand accused of one of the Alliance's high crimes, and I am, by my very nature, a high crime."
"My father always said I'd get myself into trouble," Wick said.
"We'll figure it out,"
Tiflis said, gripping her love's hand, and Gryph almost believed the sincerity in her voice.
"Can I go back to the Barrow now?"
Wick asked.
"Don't worry, my friend. I'll get us out of this,"
Gryph said, feigning a confidence he did not feel. Wick looked at him, and then to the towering dead tree above them. They crossed the green area and came to a large door in the base of the tree. A part of Gryph wanted to scream at the heresy of cutting into such a magnificent entity, but then he realized that the entrance had been grown, not cut. Several Eladrin stood rigid, holding tall elvish war spears. Unlike the dark green leather worn by the rangers, these sentinels wore armor of shining metal. Another elf, this one taller than any other Gryph had yet seen, stood in the entrance. He wore resplendent robes of silver and blue and held a war stave in one hand. He strode forward and greeted the captain.
"Welcome back, Captain Barendiel."
Thank you, Prince Regent, Berendiel said with a note of cold respect. The other man noticed, and a small smirk turned up his lip. These are the strangers you sent word of? Yes, my lord, Berendiel said, and held his left hand up. His rangers parted like a living sea, leaving Gryph and his 3 companions alone at the center. The Prince Regent walked to Tifila. He donned his head to her. I hear we have you to thank for arresting the corruption of young Farangir, the Prince Regent said. My thanks, life mistress. A flush crossed Tifila's cheek, and she curtsied at the tall elf. I fear my treatment is likely only temporary. Left unchecked, the corruption will spread. It may be beyond my ability to heal. A scowl of worry painted the Prince Regent's face. Have you been able to identify the infection? No, my lord, Tifila said. I have never seen its like. That is unfortunate. If you would, I'd like for you to speak with our healers and see what your combined expertise can come up with. I will be glad to do so, my lord, once I am assured of my companion's safety, Tifila said, showing the tall elf the toughness that Gryph had seen from her many times since the day they met. The Prince Regent was taken aback, but then smiled and nodded. Then he turned to Wick. Is it true what they have said? You are a summoner of chthonic demons? It isn't like I asked for that affinity, Wick retorted, more harshly than he should have. We cannot determine what we are at birth, only what we become in life. A flush of shame crossed Wick's face, and he muttered, I've only done it a couple of times. My father is a just man. Be open and honest with him, and he will treat you fairly. Wick nodded at the man and seemed somewhat relieved. Gryph wasn't so sure. He'd known charming talkers like the Prince Regent, and they almost always used that charm for their own ends. Next, he stood in front of Ovrim, and his face turned to a scowl. Ovrim, to his credit, held the man's gaze. Several moments passed before the tall elf spoke. By all the stars in all the realms, you are one of the fallen. I am, Ovrim said, but we now call ourselves the Zaidai. The free? The Prince Regent translated. Father told me our ancestors wiped your species from the face of Corin long ago. Ovrim said nothing, never taking his eyes from the Prince Regent. After a few more tense moments, the elf warrior smiled. Apparently, he doesn't know everything. Finally, the Prince Regent came to stand before Gryph. Eyes locked and wills battled, and then the Prince Regent smiled. I love what you've done with your hair. Shit, I forgot all about that, Gryph mentally grumbled to himself. Have a fight with some Lutins, did you? He said, and grinned. Don't worry, I've had a run-in with the little beasts. Between you and me, I'd rather face off against a Balgraf. Get your head looked at if you think that's true. The prince laughed. You're probably right. Then he cocked his head and stared at Gryph. You are a player, aren't you? I met one of your kind a long time ago. She was feisty too. Perhaps it has something to do with your ability to respawn. Death has less meaning, but then so does life. Perhaps. With that, the Prince Regent turned and motioned for Gryph and the others to enter. After a moment, Gryph crossed the threshold into the tower proper. Barendiel and several of his rangers followed, but most of the large troop remained outside. The hollow interior of the tree-turned tower was massive. Gryph noted that it could have held an entire football field in it and still had room left over for spectators. The roof extended a good 50 feet above them, and he could see wide stairs grown from twining vines winding along the walls leading to the higher floors. As Gryph and his escort entered the chamber, dozens of tall Eladrin paused to watch. Among them were a handful of dwarves and a few humans. The Prince Regent led them towards a half-moon-shaped dais. At the center, on a further raised platform, sat a resplendent throne made of tightly woven vines. Multicolored flowers grew from the back of the throne, backlit by a dim silver light that cast a wondrous multicolored halo around the room. Gryph noted the throne sat empty. A smaller, less noble chair sat lower and to the right of the main throne. A man of great bearing occupied this one. Gryph noticed the familial resemblance to the Prince Regent. On his head he wore a simple band of shining silver. It bore no jewels and lacked intricate scrollwork. This was a symbol of authority that clearly stated, "I am not a king." Surrounding the entire dais were armored guards. Like their fellows at the entrance, they bore spears, and Gryph could tell from their bearing that they were experts with the weapons. 2 other figures stood behind and to the side of the regent. One was an older and shorter elf clad in simple robes. He carried a ledger, and a quill and inkpot sat on a desk of wood that resembled a tabletop, but hovered in midair, unsupported by legs or a stand. The other was a lithe woman with piercing blue eyes. She seemed tired, and her clothing was far less ornate than the others in the room. Her near-black hair seemed more disheveled than Gryph would have expected. While almost every eye in the room was on Overham, her gaze stayed on Gryph, eyeing him warily with something verging on the edge of fear. As they got close, one guard stepped forward. His armor was the same as the other guards, except it had intricate jade scrolling on the pauldrons. He held out a hand, and the Prince Regent and the others stopped. "Who approaches the low seat of Lassendir, High Regent of Sylvan Anor, Lord Protector of the Twined Throne, devoted servant to the true High King until his return?" "Until his return!" came a chorus from all those around the room. "I, Mirthendir, second son of Lassendir, bring forth the strangers found in the blighted ruins. Their leader, a player named Gryph, has called conclave." Sounds of shock filtered through the room. While Gryph knew that the regent must have already been aware conclave had been called, he still eased forward, feigning surprise. "Then come forward, Mirthendir, son of Lassendir, and take your place at the regent's side." Mirthendir walked up and stood at his father's left, next to the odd woman. Gryph saw her shoulders tense and noted that Mirthendir did not even glance her way. A deep voice that demanded notice boomed from the regent. "You know that by calling conclave, your fate, all of your fates," he said, and let his gaze pass over the group to settle on Gryph, "are now entwined." "We only just met," Wick said in a low voice, and got a quick kick from Tifila. Gryph stepped forward, feeling odd that they had introduced him as the leader of their group. As he considered it, he realized that there was truth to the statement. He had taken charge during the battle against the corrupted creatures, and it had been his plan that had won them escape from the Barrow. It was no longer a role he relished or even wanted, but, for now at least, it was too late to belabor the point.
I am Gryph, and I understand,
Gryph said, realizing that, in fact, he did not understand. He imagined that conclave was like a trial by jury, and hoped that this assumption did not prove a fatal mistake. The regent nodded and motioned to the man with the book. The man slowly descended the dais towards Gryph and the others, and the disc holding the quill and ink pot followed. He came to a stop in front of Gryph.
I am Garthaniel, steward of Sylvan Anor, and first counselor to his lordship regent Lassendir. The questions I now ask you must be answered truthfully, or those crimes will be added to those that you are already accused of. Do you understand?
I do, said Gryph.
Place your hand on the book. It will know whether the words you speak are the truth or falsehood.
Gryph did as bidden, and felt a warmth spread through the scaled leather cover as it pulsed with life and purpose. A golden light flared around his hand, and then faded. The steward nodded and opened the book to a fresh, unmarked page and dipped the quill into the ink.
What is your name?
The steward asked.
I am known as Gryph,
Gryph responded, realizing that the name still sounded odd, somehow foreign to the man who had once been Finn Caldwell. The steward wrote his name in the book, and golden light flared around the letters, leaving the ink dry. The steward went along to the others in the group, repeating the ritual. Both Tifila and Ovrim gave their names without incident. Despite the dire circumstances they found themselves in, Gryph could not help but grin when Wick told the steward his full name. Dinkwick Flintspanner did not seem to amuse the dour steward as much as it had Gryph.
Maybe I'm just an immature idiot.
The steward did not seem aggrieved by Ovrim's existence, and Gryph noticed, unlike every other elf he'd seen to date, the shorter steward bore the hint of a 5 o'clock shadow, and his ears were more rounded than the other elves. He activated Analyze and learned that the man was a half-elf. The steward's eyes snapped up, and Gryph had the distinct impression that the man knew he'd been analyzed.
It is considered uncouth to analyze someone without permission, the steward said to him in a low voice. I would strongly advise you not to take such liberties with the regent. The man whispered the last phrase again. I strongly advise. Gryph gave the man a nod that was part apology and part understanding, and the steward nodded back in apparent acceptance of the apology. The steward turned back to the regent. They are who they claim to be, my lord. He brought the book up to the regent's chair and placed it at his side. The regent laid his hand on the book and looked at Ovrim.
Adjudicator Ovrim Nightslayer, the regent said. You are of the accursed, the forsaken, the fallen. We wiped your kind from the face of Corin many thousands of years ago. Come forward and explain how you come to stand before me.
Ovrim took a step towards the dais, and every guard seemed to grow tense. Gryph hadn't thought that was possible, and feared that the rigid guardsman would pull a muscle. Ovrim bowed ever so slightly to the regent.
My lord, you are correct. I am not of this realm. I come from the outer realms. I am a descendant of the Lost Thousand.
Gasps of shock flowed through the chamber, and even the stoic regent seemed caught off guard. He leaned forward, pain battling serenity in his eyes.
Impossible,
the regent whispered, and then caught himself. Gryph did not understand what the Lost Thousand were, but the mention of them had caught even the regent off guard.
Quite possible, my lord, Overim stated. The 1,000 Eladrin children taken by the Dark Ascendancy suffered the same fate as all high elves taken by the Arbaleth. They were tortured and corrupted, both mentally and physically. They became the fallen, the last of my species, and the most powerful. I am a descendant of those poor souls.
Gasps of horror passed through the bystanders, who had forgotten whatever tasks they'd been about to listen to the claims of this demon of yore.
But after millennia of forced servitude, one among us rose up and freed our people from the shackles of that oppression. This leader discovered she was immune to the mental conditioning the Arbaleth used to control us, and, over time, she taught the rest of us to fight back. We became the Zaidai, the free, and we are still out there today, on the front lines, fighting to hold the horrors of the Arbaleth and the Ilrith at bay. I have heard no such tales, Zaidai, the regent said.
The word Zaidai seemed to catch on his tongue in irritation.
Much has occurred in the outer realms since the Exodus, and, due to the Accords, none of this news would have reached you or any other being on Corin. Explain these Accords, the regent said. As you are no doubt aware, my lord, the Exodus was to be the final assault against the Dark Ascendancy, designed to push them from this realm and hunt them wherever they fled. However, when your ancestors and mine pursued the abominations to the outer realms, they could not know what they would find. There are many peoples and creatures who call the planets, moons, and even the empty spaces of the outer realms home. Some of these peoples are as noble as your lordship, and some others are near as terrible as the Arbaleth themselves. The Alliance realized that they needed to protect this realm from all the dangers that lay above us.
Overim looked skyward, and, despite themselves, many others in the room followed suit.
To that end, they signed the Accords, a blood oath treaty designed to prevent anyone or anything from ever setting foot on Corin again, on pain of death. They believed that this realm needed time to heal and develop, free of the old influences that had nearly destroyed it. Yet you are here, the regent said. I am, Overim said. Not only did I violate the Accords, the highest law of all the free peoples of the outer realms, but I also broke my vow as an adjudicator to uphold and defend the Accords. You realize that you have just admitted to a capital crime? I do, your lordship, but I must point out that since you are not a signatory of the Accords, and until this moment you were unaware of their existence, you have no authority to lay down any punishments listed in the Accords.
A gasp of surprise moved through the crowd, and Gryph wondered if Overim's tactic was the wisest of courses.
You have an agile legal mind, adjudicator, And you are, of course, correct that I have no authority to enforce these accords of yours. However, as you likely know, we, the regent opened his hands to encompass all of those around him, are the last defenders of the Alliance, and we take all oaths sworn to defend this realm, even those not sworn to us personally, as blood oaths. And that is a crime I do have the legal authority to punish. By your own admission, you have proven your guilt.
I have, Ovrim stated, never taking his yellow eyes from the regent.
Would you care to explain why?
I came to Corin in search of my old master, a man as much father as a teacher. A man driven mad by his desire to protect this world and those that lay beyond it. In an ancient tome, he found the locations of the lost prime godheads. He came to believe that by finding and bonding with one of the divine artifacts, he could protect the realms. The regent's face seemed to turn pale at the mention of the divine artifact, and more murmurs of shock flowed through the room. Wick cast a nervous glance at Gryph.
The Pantheon has claimed all the lost godheads,
Mirthendir said, stepping forward.
I have seen these new gods of the Pantheon myself. They came by their rule through conquest given them, in part, by the beings known as players.
Mirthendir lowered his gaze to Gryph.
There are no more godheads unaccounted for.
He returned his gaze to Ovrim. I do not know the truth of that, my lord, Ovrim began. What I do know is that my master was already a powerful adjudicator, perhaps the most powerful the Order had ever produced, before his mind turned to his dark obsession. If the rumor was even a possibility, I owed it to him, and to the people whose lives my vow was intended to protect, to do all in my power to see that he did not fall further into darkness. Mirthendir grew quiet, and the regent turned his gaze inward, deep in thought.
He speaks the truth, my lord,
the elf woman said. The regent turned to her with a look that lay somewhere between concern and inquiry.
Are you sure?
The regent said.
The Zaidai speaks true,
she said. Then the odd elven woman eased her way past Mirthendir and slowly descended the stairs of the dais towards Ovrim and Gryph.
Daughter, my ward,
the regent said, his voice a mix of curiosity and alarm.
I beg you, stay next to me where it is safe.
I will be fine, father. This is the man I have foreseen.
She walked past Ovrim and came to Gryph. She held up her hands wide, as if seeking permission. Gryph did not know what to make of this gesture, but her warm smile somehow eased his concern, and before he realized it, he had lowered his head to her. Her small hands cradled his head, and she closed her eyes.
A player this man may be, but he is of the realms, and has lived many lives both here and in a faraway place outside all the realms. I can feel the wisps of his soul, who he once was, and what he may become. He is now a man of infinite potential.
Shit, Gryph thought. Can she feel the godhead?
But he was many people before. Among many others, he was once the Dalmir king who lost his mind.
You are saying that in a past life he was the last Stone King?
Lassindir said, his voice quavering. The Stone King? Can it be? Gryph remembered the odd, uncontrolled visions he'd experienced while in the soul reverie. That was real. Yes, and he is a harbinger of both dark and light times. She opened her violet eyes and stared deep into Gryph's. He brings with him the key to an ancient secret. His arrival hearkens a time of doom or a time of renewal. Our fates are now entwined. She paused, and her eyes filled with terror. The dwellers in the dark have come. Their time is at hand. Gryph felt the hands at his temples waver, and then the woman collapsed. Gryph caught her before she could fall to the floor.
Celendriel!
Yelled Barendiel, the captain of the Rangers, and he rushed to her, pushing Gryph aside as he cradled her head. Both the regent and Myrthendir also rushed to her side, the regent casting aside his formality to check on his adopted daughter. The prince regent kept a respectful distance. Gryph could see she was still breathing. The captain realized the same and leapt to his feet, a flash of steel announcing the sharp dagger at Gryph's throat.
What have you done to her?
Barendiel said, and Gryph could see the fear animating the man's anger.
Sheath your weapon, Captain,
the regent barked in a voice that could not be ignored.
He did nothing to your sister. It is her own accursed ability that she is a victim of.
Barendiel scowled for a moment, but then pulled the blade from Gryph's throat, drew it along his own hand, drawing a thin line of blood. Then he wiped it clean on his cloak and returned it to its housing. Barendiel backed away, never taking his eyes from Gryph. The other guards had their spears lowered at Wick, Tifila, and Ovrim, ensuring they stayed put. One of his rangers handed him a strip of cloth that he wrapped around his hand.
Once a ranger draws his weapon, it must taste blood,
Myrthendir whispered to Gryph as the other elf stood.
You are lucky my father intervened.
Several elves rushed to Celendriel's side, and the regent allowed them to help her to her feet. Her eyes seemed glazed, clouded over by some terrible vision she could not explain. She grabbed Gryph's hand in a fierce grip, and her mouth dropped. She looked down at Gryph's soul-bound satchel in alarm, reaching a tentative hand out to caress its leather surface. Strong hands pulled her away from Gryph, and the regent took her into his arms. She looked up at the regent, eyes pleading, "Please, you must believe me. This man from a realm beyond the realms is the key to all our survival. You must help him."
Hush now, my child. Rest,
the regent said. Celendriel's eyes came to Gryph's, and then he heard her. No, felt her in his mind. "I know what you carry, the seal and the eggs. You must keep them safe. You must let no one acquire them, or I fear doom and destruction will claim us all. If anyone opens the city, death will follow. Promise me you will keep them safe." You have been offered the quest Celendriel's Plea. Cylindriel, the ward and adopted daughter of the regent Lacendir, has asked you to protect the seal of the Dwarven King and the Arbaleth eggs. The dwellers in the dark have long haunted the dark recesses of Sylvan Anor, and the seal and the eggs could allow them to bring about a second dark ascendancy. Difficulty, incredible. Reward, increased reputation with Cylindriel and safety of the realms. XP, 20,000. Do you accept this quest? Yes or no? Gryph didn't know what to make of her plea. Her mind was more present than Ovrim's and the others had been when he'd heard their thoughts. It was times like these that he missed Lex. He still didn't understand all the rules of the realms, and while he understood the word incredible, he didn't quite know what to make of the sliding scale of difficulty regarding quests. This was also the first quest that had mentioned reputation. Just another thing that he didn't understand about the realms. Her intensity, the power of her need, seeped into Gryph, and he found that he believed her. Is this a trick? Some part of her ability? Gryph saw her intense eyes staring at him, and he finally nodded and accepted the quest. He felt a surge of warmth move through his body and knew in the back of his mind that the quest had somehow melded with his soul. Where the hell are you, Lex? Then Cylindriel lapsed into unconsciousness, and Gryph saw a moment of pain cross the regent's face before his role as leader took over once again. The regent stood and stared at Gryph, and his eyes were deep pools of suspicion. Never taking his eyes from Gryph, he held his hand out.
Bring me the player's bag.
Barendiel handed Gryph's soul-bound satchel to the regent. The regal elf closed his eyes as if sending his will into the bag.
A soul-bound bag,
the regent muttered, and then looked up at Gryph.
A rare item indeed. What is it you are trying to hide?
He closed his eyes once more and concentrated.
The Journal of Jebus,
the regent said aloud with little interest. Wick's eyes snapped up to Gryph at the mention of his dead cousin's journal, and his eyes seemed to beg the truth from Gryph. Gryph's expression was one of regret. Wick's first action upon meeting Gryph had nearly led to the player's death, and this had been before Gryph had known he could respawn. In his anger, he had decided not to give the journal to Wick, and then, later, the heat of battle had forced the journal from his mind. Seeing the pain in his small friend's eyes, Gryph knew the gnome saw his withholding as a betrayal.
The seal of the Dwarven King,
Lacendir said, and gasps flowed through those assembled.
Who are you?
Barendiel said, advancing on Gryph, hand on his dagger once more. Mirthendir placed a hand on the irate captain's forearm to stop the man from drawing his weapon again. Lacendir's eyes widened, and his head snapped up at Gryph. The elder elf stood and crossed the distance between them quicker than Gryph would have thought possible, and then the regent's own blade lay against Gryph's throat.
Not one, but 2 Arbaleth eggs,
the regent hissed. Gasps of shock rose to squeals of horror at the mention of the eggs. Gryph's eyes followed these gasps and discovered that several of them had come from his own friends.
Damn it,
Leprompts warned you how dangerous those things were, Gryph thought.
Are you the dweller in the dark?
The regent demanded.